At 0847 on the morning of October 14th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Raymond Sullivan stood on the chilly English flight line and watched a formation of 291 B-17 bombers claw their way into the sky. He knew, with a certainty that made his stomach turn, that maybe half of them would ever come back. He was 19 years old, a farm kid from Kansas turned gunnery instructor, 7 months on the job, and he had exactly 0 real answers to the problem that was killing American bomber crews by the hundreds. This wasn't guesswork. The Germans had already shown what they could do over Schweinfurt. 2 months earlier, in August, the first raid on the city's ball-bearing plants had turned into a flying slaughterhouse. Out of 376 B-17 seconds sent, 60 never made it home, 600 men dead, missing, or prisoners in a single day. The crews who limped back told the same nightmare story over and over. Fighters coming straight in from 12 o'clock high, head on, and somehow no one could hit them. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything with wings at those bombers. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, even heavy Me 110 destroyers loaded with rockets. But it wasn't the variety that mattered. It was the method. The Germans had spent 2 years perfecting head-on attacks, and by 1943, they'd turned it into an industrial process of destruction. Fighters would form up in tight lines, dive from ahead at a shallow angle, and close at a combined speed of around 600 miles per hour. At that speed, a B-17 gunner had maybe 3 seconds, 3 heartbeats to spot the fighter, swing his guns, calculate deflection, and fire. On paper, the manuals made it sound simple. Lead the target, they said. Calculate closure rate. Aim where the aircraft will be, not where it is. In reality, the human brain just couldn't keep up. By the time a gunner tried to aim ahead of a fighter closing at 850 feet per second, the German had already flashed past, guns blazing, and was gone. The statistics proved it. Of the 60 B-17 seconds shot down in that first Schweinfurt raid, 48 had been killed by frontal attacks, fighters coming straight down the bomber's throat, pilots aiming for the cockpit, American gunners spraying the sky and hitting nothing. The architect of that terror was a German ace named Major Egon Meyer of JG-2. He'd studied American bomber formations and realized that the nose guns simply couldn't lay effective fire on high-speed frontal targets. Meyer refined a brutal but elegant tactic. Attack from 12 o'clock high, dive at shallow angle, open fire at about 800 yards, and aim right at the pilots. Kill the crew, not the machine. Break away before the bomber's side gunners could bring their weapons to bear. Meyer personally shot down 102 Allied bombers using this method. His pilots destroyed over 200 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds between January and October 1943. They called it Kopfschuss headshot. American crews had a simpler word for it: murder. Sullivan had trained 43 gunners since March. He'd taught them everything the manual preached: smooth trigger control, proper lead, perfect tracking. Then he watched them climb into B-17 seconds and fly toward Germany. Some came back, most didn't, and the ones who did return all said the same thing. They came straight at us, too fast to hit. That morning, as 291 bombers disappeared into the grey English sky, Sullivan wasn't just watching airplanes. He was watching a problem no officer, no manual, and no committee had solved. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a farm kid's memory of coyotes and chickens was starting to scratch at the door. Long before he was timing German fighters over Europe, Sullivan was timing something else entirely: coyotes in Kansas. He'd grown up on a small farm outside Junction City, in a house where the family's entire income flapped and clucked in a dusty yard. 200 chickens, no more, no less, with the difference between eating well through winter or going hungry. Every bird had a $sign on its feathers, and every winter, something came down out of the hills to cash in: coyotes. They learned the routine of the farm as if they'd studied it from a briefing map. They waited for dusk, when the light went flat and the cold crept in, then slipped out of the tree line and sprinted for the chicken yard. By the time anyone shouted, they'd already grabbed 3 or 4 birds and vanished back into the dark. In the winter of 1936, Sullivan's father lost 23 chickens that way. 23 birds at $2 each, $46 gone. For the Sullivans, that was half a month's income erased by teeth and speed. When Raymond turned 12, his father put a Winchester .22 rifle in his hands and gave him a job title more serious than anything he'd ever hold in the army: Chicken guard. You lose them, his father said. We don't eat. There was no manual, no classroom, just a man who'd lived his whole life knowing that winter didn't care about excuses. Sullivan did what any kid would do. He tried to aim at the coyotes as they ran. He tracked them, swung with them, tried to lead them, and he missed again and again. The animals were too fast, too erratic, too close to the coop by the time he fired. One evening, after another failed shot, his father took the rifle from him, sighted down the barrel at a bare corner of fence, and said something the Army Air Force's gunnery manual would never print. Don't aim where the coyote is. Don't even aim where you think it's going to be. Pick a place it has to go through and wait. Let it run into your bullets. The first time Sullivan tried, it was November 3rd, 1936. A coyote broke from the trees, running about 30 miles per hour straight toward the chicken coop. Instead of chasing it with his sights, Sullivan picked a fixed point, the corner of the fence, maybe 40 feet ahead of where the animal was. He held the rifle there. Didn't move, didn't track. When the coyote hit that invisible line in his mind, he pressed the trigger. The animal dropped mid-stride, dead before it hit the ground. For 4 winters, Sullivan repeated that method. 47 coyotes, 47 kills. He never missed once. His father never explained the math, never said a word about vectors or closure rates. He just nodded and said, "Told you it works." But Raymond understood in his own way. A running animal follows a path. Pick a fixed point on that path, put lead in that point at the right time, and the animal will run straight into death. No complicated calculations, no chasing, just patience and timing. Now, in 1943, he was watching American gunners do the opposite at 25,000 feet. They were trying to track German fighters the way he'd once tried to track coyotes, and they were missing, and they were dying. For weeks, the thought had been gnawing at him. What if they stopped trying to calculate deflection altogether? What if they treated German fighters like coyotes, picked a spot in the sky those fighters had to pass through and filled it with bullets? He'd mentioned it to the gunnery officer in September. The man shut it down instantly. "You track the target, Sergeant. You don't fire into empty space." Doctrine was doctrine. Chickens and coyotes didn't show up in the manual. So that October morning, as the B-17 seconds droned toward Germany, Sullivan brought something the manual didn't mention either: a stopwatch and a notebook. If no one would listen to farm logic, he'd make them listen to math. He was going to measure exactly how long gunners had to engage, calculate how far ahead they needed to aim, and prove on paper that shooting empty sky could kill real fighters. By 1600 hours, he told himself, he'd either prove the farm kid method worked, or watch another 60 B-17 seconds disappear from the roster. And if you want to see whether Sullivan's Coyote Method actually saved those bomber crews, do one thing right now. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube this is a story worth keeping alive. The second Schweinfurt raid left England like a hammer being swung in slow motion. At 0847, 291 B-17 seconds lifted off, each one carrying 10 men and a belly full of bombs. Their target was the same as in August. Schweinfurt, Germany's ball-bearing heart. Without those bearings, tank turrets wouldn't turn, aircraft propellers wouldn't spin, Panzer gearboxes would seize. The 8th Air Force knew it, the Germans knew it, and somewhere between England and Schweinfurt, thousands of German fighters were waiting to decide which side's war machine would keep moving. Sullivan couldn't go with them. Instructors stayed on the ground. So he climbed to the control tower observation deck, stopwatch in one hand, notebook in the other, headphones pressed over his ears so he could listen to the radio traffic from 25,000 feet above Germany. At 10:15, the bombers crossed into German airspace. The radios were calm, almost boring, weather good, formation tight, navigation on course. It sounded like any other mission until 10:27. Fighters, 12 o'clock high, count 5 to 0 plus. They're forming for a head-on pass. Sullivan clicked his stopwatch. Up there, the German fighters, BF, 109 seconds, W 190 seconds, and heavy twin-engined Me 110 seconds rolled over into shallow dives from around 28,000 feet. They spread out in a grim, symmetrical wall, a line abreast that filled the sky in front of the lead bombers. Then they came in. B. 17 gunners opened up. Sullivan heard the shouted bearings, the curses, the frantic reports. He stared at the second hand, sweeping his stopwatch dial. The engagement, those terrifying few seconds, when fighters screamed straight into the formation and then broke away, lasted just 23 seconds. 23 seconds of continuous fire from dozens of bombers, thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition hurled into the sky. And yet, as the calls came back in, one fact cut through the chaos. No German fighters had gone down. The fighters came around for another pass. Same angle, same head-on attack. Sullivan heard the stress creeping into the gunners' voices, men doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, and watching it fail. Damage reports crackled in. 3 B-17 seconds hit on the second pass. One bomber falling out of formation. Shoots in the air. A crew bailing out over Germany. Sullivan glanced at his notebook. He'd been filling it with rough math, shapes and arrows scrawled over grid paper. A B-17 flew straight and level at roughly 180 miles per hour. A German fighter dove in at about 400. Combined closing speed, 580 miles per hour, about 850 feet per second. That gave a gunner maybe 3 seconds to see the fighter, get on target, and fire. In those 3 seconds, the distance between them collapsed by over 2,500 feet. If a gunner aimed directly at the oncoming fighter, his bullets took roughly 0.4 seconds to reach that point in space. In 0.4 seconds at 850 feet per second, the fighter moved about 340 feet. By the time the rounds got there, the German was already past that spot. The gunner would always be behind the target, always. The manual's answer was to lead the target by that 340 feet, but to do that in real time, with angles shifting every fraction of a second, while the bomber shook under flak and fear, was asking a human brain to be a mechanical computer. It wasn't going to happen. Sullivan stared at his own diagram. What if the solution wasn't to chase the fighter with math? What if you simply picked a point, say 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber along the fighter's path, and held your guns there? Bullets to 2,000 feet took about 0.7 seconds in flight. In those 0.7 seconds, the fighter would travel nearly 600 feet, but it had to pass through that 2,000-foot point on its way in. That meant the fighter would fly through a long, steady stream of fire for more than 2 seconds. No tracking, no last-second guessing, just a fixed killing zone in the sky. Down below the math, the radio told a harsher story. By late afternoon, the surviving bombers began limping home. Sullivan stood on the field and counted them as they landed. 229 out of 291. 62 B-17 seconds gone. Around 620 men dead, captured, or missing. The gunners who staggered into the debriefing room looked hollowed out. They'd fired until the barrels glowed, done everything by the book, and still watched German fighters carve through the formation. Sullivan looked at the numbers in his notebook, at the red-eyed men in front of him, and realized something simple and terrible. He couldn't save the crews who had just died over Schweinfurt, but if he didn't find a way to turn his notebook into a new way of shooting, if he didn't convince someone to let him turn German fighters into coyotes, tomorrow's crews would die the same way. That evening, the debriefing room smelled like burnt coffee, cold sweat, and cordite that had seeped into every fiber of every flight jacket. Sullivan moved through the crowd of exhausted men like someone walking among wreckage, looking for pieces that could still be used. He found Sergeant William Morrison first. Morrison was a top turret gunner, 11 missions in, the kind of man the others watched when they wanted to know how scared they were allowed to be. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands still shaking slightly from hours behind the guns. When Sullivan asked him how many German fighters he'd hit that day, Morrison gave a flat, bitter answer. 0. It wasn't for lack of trying. He'd fired roughly 800 rounds over Schweinfurt, done everything the manual demanded, tracked the fighters, calculated deflection as best he could through sheer instinct, squeezed the trigger the right way, and still, not a single confirmed kill. Watching the smoke drift across the ceiling, he admitted what every gunner already knew. Against head-on attacks, the manual was a death sentence. "Do you want to try something different?" Sullivan asked. Morrison blinked. "Different how?" "A way that doesn't ask you to calculate lead at 600 miles an hour," Sullivan said. "A way where the fighter comes to you." Morrison stared at him, halfway between suspicion and desperate hope. "Will it keep me from dying on my next mission?" Sullivan hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Maybe. Probably. The math says it should," Morrison agreed. Because dying according to the manual didn't sound any better than dying some other way. One by one, Sullivan pulled in 5 more men, top turret and ball turret gunners, experienced enough to know what wasn't working, and stubborn enough to try something that violated everything they'd been taught. Staff Sergeant Joseph Brennan, the ball turret gunner, had been a machinist in Detroit, the kind of man who trusted precision. Technical Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, sharp-eyed and multilingual, had watched his best friend, waist gunner Tommy Rodriguez, cut in half by a 20mm shell while German fighters cruised past untouched. The remaining 3 were younger corporals, fresh out of gunnery school, and already old in the way only men who had seen 2 missions over Germany could be. They gathered in a quiet briefing room. Sullivan set his notebook on the table, picked up a piece of chalk, and turned to the blackboard. He sketched a B-17 flying straight and level, nose pointed forward. Then he drew a line sweeping down from 12 o'clock high, a German fighter's attack path. "You've been taught to do this," he said, drawing a curved line that followed the fighter, gun barrels chasing it, trying to guess where it would be. Track the target, lead the target, never fire at empty sky. He wiped that curved line away and drew a single X on the fighter's straight path, some distance out in front of the B-17. "What if instead," he said, "you pick a point in space right here, a point that fighter must pass through, and you just hold your guns there? Let him fly into your bullets." Morrison frowned. "How do we know that point is right?" Sullivan filled the board with numbers. Fighter at 400 miles per hour, bomber at 180. Closure rate, 580 miles per hour, 850 feet per second. Bullets at roughly 2,800 feet per second. Time of flight to 2,000 feet, 0.7 seconds. In that time, the fighter covers nearly 600 feet, but it still has to pass through that 2,000-foot point on its way in. If the gunner starts firing early and holds steady, the fighter spends over 2 seconds flying straight through a dense cone of fire. "You're not tracking a moving target," Sullivan said quietly. "You're shooting a fence corner in the sky. Same as a coyote running for the chicken coop." Brennan asked what happened if they missed the point. "You don't," Sullivan replied. "The point doesn't move. The only thing that moves is whether you commit to it." They were skeptical. This was heresy. It sounded too simple, too much like luck dressed up in math. But simplicity was exactly what they needed at 25,000 feet, with flak bursting around them. So Sullivan made them a promise he couldn't quite guarantee, but believed with everything he had. "We'll test it tomorrow. If it fails, we go back to the manual. If it works," he didn't need to finish the sentence. The next morning, they would find out if German fighters were really just coyotes with cannons. The next morning, the farm kids' heresy met cold metal and roaring engines. Sullivan rode out to the gunnery range with his 6 volunteers, the notebook on his lap and a knot in his stomach. Waiting for them was a squat, grounded B-17 and a single fighter parked off to the side, a P-47 Thunderbolt, all muscle and engine, flown by Captain James Fletcher. Fletcher had flown 41 combat missions. He knew exactly what German fighters did to bombers and exactly how helpless gunners felt when head-on attacks came in. Sullivan explained the plan. The B-17 would sit on the ground, guns loaded with chalk-filled training rounds. Fletcher would make simulated head-on passes at low altitude, flying straight at the bomber in a shallow dive. The gunners would not track him. They would not lead him. They would pick a point in the sky, roughly 2,000 feet out, hold their guns there, and let the fighter fly through their fire. Fletcher stared at him like he'd suggested shooting backwards. "Any gunner with sense tracks the target," he said. "Any gunner with sense missed German fighters over Schweinfurt," Sullivan answered. Fletcher thought about that, then nodded. He'd seen the wreckage. He climbed into his cockpit, fired up the Thunderbolt's engine, and rolled out. Sergeant Morrison went first, climbing into the top turret of the grounded B-17. Sullivan squeezed in beside him, headset on, voice low and steady. "Pick your point. Lock it in. Don't chase him." Conception. Up above, Fletcher climbed to about 5,000 feet and rolled in. Morrison watched the P-47 appear at 12 o'clock high, dropping toward them, every instinct screaming to swing with the target. The fighter grew in the turret glass 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,000, 500. "Hold the point," Sullivan said. "Trust it." At an estimated 2,000 feet, Sullivan gave the word, "Now." Morrison squeezed the trigger. The turret shook, the air filled with the stink of gunpowder and hot oil, and a solid river of chalk-laced 50 caliber rounds poured into that invisible fence corner in the sky. The P-47 flew straight through the stream. A moment later, Fletcher's voice came over the radio. "Range. This is Fletcher. I've got multiple chalk strikes on my left wing and fuselage. If this were combat, I'd be dead." Morrison just stared, stunned. He had killed a fighter he had never actually aimed at, The others demanded their turn. Brennan, Kowalski, the three young corporals, they all climbed into the turrets in turn, picked a point 2,000 feet out, and held steady as Fletcher made pass after pass. Not every burst was perfect. Some gunners fired a little high, some a little low, but every single one scored hits. When Fletcher landed, his P-47 looked like it had flown through a chalk storm, white marks speckling wings and fuselage. Fletcher found Sullivan on the range and jabbed a thumb at his battered Thunderbolt. "You need to teach this to every gunner in England." Yesterday, there was just one problem. Doctrine. To change how an Air Force fought, you had to convince someone whose rank came with stars, not stripes. Sullivan requested a meeting with Major General Frederick Anderson, commander of the 3rd Bomb Division, a man known for caring more about results than paperwork. Official channels denied the request. Anderson was busy. The gunnery sergeant from Kansas was not on the schedule, so Sullivan went to Anderson's headquarters anyway. The aide at the door tried to block him. Sullivan, exhausted and raw from Schweinfurt, said the one thing that might cut through. "Sir, I have a method that will cut bomber losses in half." The aide started to dismiss him. "The general doesn't have time for theoretical." "It's not theoretical," Sullivan snapped. "We tested it. It works." Inside, Anderson heard the edge in his voice and called him in. Sullivan had 5 minutes. He spread his notebook on the general's desk. Diagrams of attack angles, timings, closure rates, bullet flight times, the P-47 test results. He explained how head-on tactics worked, why tracking failed at 600 miles per hour, and how fixed-point fire control turned frontal attacks into suicide runs for German pilots. Anderson flipped through the pages, then looked up. "You tested this with real aircraft?" "Yes, sir. 6 gunners. All scored hits. Better than the manual method." "What do you need?" 2 days. Access to the gunnery range. Volunteer crews. Permission to train them my way. Anderson thought for a moment. "You get 3 days," he said. "Prove it works or stop wasting time." That night, Sullivan went back to his 6 original volunteers. They were no longer just gunners. They were instructors. Each would train 5 more men. Within days, word began to spread from bomber to bomber, barracks to barracks. The method picked up nicknames: farm kid aiming, coyote shooting. But the official label in Sullivan's notes was simple: fixed point fire control. By October 18th, 30 gunners had been trained. By October 20th, 70. And on October 24th, the 8th Air Force would put Sullivan's idea to its first real test over enemy skies. On October 24th, the math left the chalkboard and went to war. The 8th Air Force launched another deep raid into Germany, this time toward Osnabrück, along the same deadly corridor where the Luftwaffe had been butchering bomber formations for months. In the middle of that stream of silver bombers were 43 B-17 seconds, whose gunners had been trained in Sullivan's fixed-point method. They didn't look any different from the others. Same olive-drab paint, same roaring engines, same scared young men inside. The only difference was what those men intended to do when German fighters came head-on. At 11:03, the call came over the radios. "Fighters, 12 o'clock high. Multiple bandits forming up for a frontal pass." In the old days, that meant brace for murder. This time, when the specks ahead grew into shapes, the Sullivan-trained gunners did something that would have gotten them failed in school. They didn't track. They didn't chase. They picked invisible fence corners in the sky, fixed points 2,000 feet ahead of their bombers, and locked their guns there. The German fighters rolled in. Me 109 seconds led the first wave, W 190 seconds behind them, coming in fast, confident in a tactic that had worked for nearly a year. They flew straight into a river of 50 caliber fire. 3 Me 109 seconds went down on the first pass, shredded as they crossed those fixed points. 2 Few 190 seconds were blown apart on the second wave. The German formation wavered, suddenly aware that the bombers in front of them were not behaving the way their training films said they would. After a third bloody pass, having lost 7 fighters in 4 minutes, the Luftwaffe broke off entirely. Head-on attacks that had once been relatively safe were now suicidal. The bombers pressed on, dropped their loads on target, and turned for home. Total losses for the day: 4 B-17 seconds. None of them were from the 43 aircraft whose gunners used Sullivan's method. When those planes rolled back onto the English airfields, Major General Frederick Anderson was waiting on the tarmac. He didn't stay in his office. He watched each B-17 land, counted them, looked up at their tails as if checking a math problem he desperately wanted to be right. Morrison climbed down from his turret, face smeared with gun smoke, flight suit soaked through. He had just shot down 2 German fighters, more than he'd managed in his previous 11 missions combined. He found Sullivan on the flight line, grabbed his shoulder, and said 4 words that would echo in Sullivan's head for the rest of his life. "You saved my life." Brennan followed, grinning in disbelief. He'd nailed an FW-190 on the 3rd pass, watched it fly straight into his fixed stream of fire and disintegrate. "First time I've ever seen my bullets actually hit what I aimed at," he said. Kowalski had dropped a May 109 and thought of Tommy Rodriguez. "Today," he told Sullivan, "they learned how it feels." Anderson pulled Sullivan aside. "How many gunners have you trained?" 73, sir, across 4 bomb groups." "Train everyone," Anderson said. "Every gunner in 8th Air Force, starting tomorrow." The method spread like electricity. By November 1st, Sullivan had trained about 200 gunners. By November 15th, roughly 450. By December 1st, around 800. Each trained gunner became an instructor, passing the method from turret to turret, squadron to squadron. The numbers changed almost as fast as the tactics. In September 1943, before fixed point fire control, the 8th Air Force lost 352 heavy bombers in combat. By December, after widespread adoption of Sullivan's method, losses dropped to 189. German fighter kills on bombers fell by roughly 60% in that period. Head-on attacks, once the Luftwaffe's favorite tool, started disappearing from after-action reports, replaced by more cautious beam attacks from 3 and 9 o'clock. By January 1944, over just 3 months, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 220 fighters to bomber defensive fire, many of them brought down by gunners using Sullivan's fixed-point shooting. Throughout 1,944, German losses to bomber gunners climbed to about 1,840 fighters, more than twice the year before. Some of that came from better training and escort fighters, but a large share came from a simple change. Stop chasing targets and make them run into your bullets. Sullivan himself was pulled back to the United States in March 1944. The Army Air Forces wanted him at gunnery schools in Texas and Nevada, imprinting the method on new crews before they ever saw combat. He trained approximately 3,400 gunners. By mid-1944, fixed-point fire control wasn't Sullivan's trick anymore. It was Doctrine. The manuals were rewritten. Instructors taught his method first. Traditional tracking became the backup technique. And yet, on paper, Sullivan almost vanished. After the war, jets and missiles made machine gun defensive fire obsolete. Bombers lost their tail guns. Tactics moved on. Training films were archived. Manuals were updated. Sullivan left the service in 1946, turned down a commission, and went back to Kansas. He raised chickens, shot coyotes, married, raised 3 children, and worked the farm for 42 years. He never bragged, never claimed to have changed anything. When people asked about the war, he just said, "I taught men to shoot." In 1987, a military historian, digging through dusty training documents, found repeated references to fixed-point fire control and one name, Sergeant Raymond Sullivan. Following the paper trail, he calculated that Sullivan's method directly saved between 250 and 350 American bomber crewmen. In November and December 1943 alone, gunners personally trained by Sullivan were credited with 37 confirmed German fighters destroyed. Hundreds more kills came from gunners who had learned the method second or third hand. The historian tracked Sullivan down, found him at 65, still working the farm, still shooting coyotes. Sullivan shrugged off the numbers. He didn't count kills. He remembered faces Morrison, Brennan, Kowalski, and all the crews who came home because the coyotes in the sky had finally run into something they couldn't outrun. Sullivan died on July 8th, 1992, at age 68, of a heart attack in the fields he'd worked his whole life. His obituary in the local paper called him a World War II gunnery instructor. Nothing more. No medals, no citations, no mention of 300 lives saved. But 3 men came to his funeral that the family didn't know. Former top turret gunners, veterans of 1,944 bomber missions. They introduced themselves afterward and told Sullivan's children the truth. They had been trained in fixed-point fire control. Each of them believed, with the same cold certainty Sullivan had felt watching bombers take off, that his method had kept them alive. Today, Sullivan's story survives in fragments, marginal notes in the National Archives, a paragraph in a book on bomber tactics, a training film where an anonymous narrator explains how to pick a point ahead of the attacking fighter and let him fly into your fire, never mentioning the Kansas farm kid who wrote that script with a stopwatch and a memory of coyotes. That's how innovation usually happens in war, not from shiny headquarters presentations, but from sergeants who refuse to accept that the manual says so is an excuse for men dying. Sullivan shot coyotes for 47 years and never missed. When he turned that idea on German fighters, they started missing him. Official history may not remember his name, but you do now. If this story hit you the way it hit us, do something small that means a lot. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about forgotten heroes. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next buried story we drag out of the archives. And drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and if someone in your family served. Every comment, every like, is one more voice saying men like Raymond Sullivan won't just fade into silence.